Thank you so much, Fisher, and thank you for joining us today, whether it be evening, morning, or afternoon for you. My name, as Fisher said, is Grace, and I have had the immense privilege of serving as your host as we walk through this series on ecology, love of home, and farming and environmental stewardship. So in this series, we're considering what it means to love our communities well in all their particularity and all their beauty. Sir Roger Scruton suggested in his book, Green Philosophy, that rootedness and a love of home, which he calls oikophilia, must be at the center of our efforts at stewardship, care, and reform. Over the past several months, we've talked to Mary Berry of the Berry Center, to authors and farmers James Rebanks and Gabe Brown, to theology professor Norman Wiersbe, and to Lady Scruton about their efforts to steward their places and to animate our moral imaginations and our efforts at placekeeping through a love of place and love of home. So today we have the great privilege of hosting Jamie Blackett, who is a former Army officer and a farmer on the beautiful Arbigland Peninsula on the Solway Firth in Dumfries and Galloway. He is also an award-winning journalist and a regular columnist for the Daily Telegraph, Country Life, and other publications. He appears regularly on television and radio as a commentator on politics and rural issues. His first book, The Enigma of Kidston, has been adapted for the stage. Land of Milk and Honey is the sequel to his second book, the much-acclaimed Red Rag to a Bull. In 2020, he won the Charles Douglas Home Memorial Trust Award for journalism, and his essay has been published in a short book on wilding. Jamie is married with 2 grown children, one of whom I think is at home, as we were talking about earlier. I'm so excited to talk to Jamie about his work and his farm. We're going to talk for approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. So please be thinking of questions that you might like to ask and add them to the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen as we discuss. We'll try to touch on those questions as we finish. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Grace. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be asked on to the Roger Scruton Foundation podcast. He was a great hero of mine.
And of mine as well. One of the first questions we have asked each of our guests in this series is, how would you describe your own environmental ethic? What values or principles undergird your vision of what it means to steward your place?
Well, Roger had this idea of oikophilia, and I'm definitely an oik when it comes to looking after the land, and I feel very hefted here, but also very often under threat from an increasingly authoritarian government and a political class, really, not just a government, who treat us oiks with a certain amount of contempt, I think, and look down their noses at us. And yeah, I think Roger often talks about Burke's little platoon, and I see what we do here as being a little platoon, doing what we can in our own little corner of the world for the environment. In terms of my approach, I know you had Gabe Brown on here not long ago, and his book Dirt to Soil is very seminal now in farming ecology, and I'd very much try and take a holistic approach as he does to everything we do here. Very biased towards looking after the wildlife and the natural environment, but also, you know, we're a commercial farm and we have to make money, and we try and farm as efficiently as possible, but in such a way that, you know, it's regenerative, and we try and do as many different other things as well on the estate, just to help the local economy, help create jobs for people, places for people to live, try and build and sustain a community here around our own family, and then we've got other other people living here who do stuff. And now that we actually have a dairy here, which is been a great thing financially in all ways, really. But it's also brought in a lot of enthusiastic young people, and we live in a very aging part of the world. It's been very invigorating to have lots of young people in their 20s suddenly arriving, bright young graduates keen to get on in the world of dairying, and that's really galvanized things quite a lot.
I would love to touch on that issue of drawing young people back to rural areas. I think the aging of rural communities is something we observe quite drastically here in the US as well. But just to situate your work so that listeners who perhaps haven't read it have a sense for what your little platoon is and where it is. How would you describe your place where you currently live in, and how did you come to live there?
Well, I live in a very beautiful part of the world in southwest Scotland, in that part of the ancient kingdom of Galloway, which now, for administrative purposes, falls within the county of Dumfriesshire. And we are a peninsula sticking out into the Solway Firth. I actually can look across the Solway, which I'm doing now. So I look to my right, at James Rebanks's farm in the Lake District. I know James, and he's taken me around his farm. And in fact, his cousin is married to my farm manager here. And so I can see his farm, which is on the Lake District fells. We look across at the mountains of the Lake District, and we are, but well, we're not quite the southernmost tip of Scotland, but we're on Scotland's south coast, if you can visualize that. It's a very, very rural part of the world. Agriculture and forestry and tourism are really the only things that happen here much. Although inevitably in the bureaucracy that we live in, that Roger Scruton wrote so much about, most people here live, work for the state as civil servants in offices, but and the rest of us are kind of supporting them, I guess, really, giving them things to inspect. But yes, I mean, it's about as rural as you can get in Britain.
Excellent. It's interesting you talk about the many years you spent in the military and deciding at some point that you really wanted to return, because this is a place too that's been in your family for multiple generations, if I'm remembering correctly. How did you decide that you wanted to go back, that you wanted to move back into this landscape?
Well, I suppose it comes back to that idea of oikophilia, of being hefted to a place, and I suppose some people might think it's a rather unfair system, but so, inheriting land through a process of primogeniture. I'm the oldest of my siblings, and so I suppose it was really from as long ago as I can remember, really, expected that I would come back here, and also that probably that I would have before then served in the army, which is again a sort of family tradition, and is quite a long tradition in landowning families that really almost sort of kind of stretches back to the days when landowners were expected to turn up with their little platoons when the king wanted to go off and invade France or whatever, to the days of knights and in shining armor and that kind of thing. But I mean, that is very much has continued, and so that my completely lacking any sort of imagination, I just followed the family template of going off to the army for about 20 years and then coming home to run the estate. And I suppose that sense of destiny, I suppose, ran through me like the urge to migrate runs through a salmon or a swallow or a goose or something. I got to a stage where I was in the army, and in fact I wrote about it in one of the books, that I was in Northern Ireland, which is very similar sort of countryside, serving out there during the Troubles, and I suddenly realized, actually, this is the landscape where I want to be, and I've got to leave the army as soon as I've finished here. In fact, I did stay on for a couple more years, but and get back home and become a farmer. That was a very strong pull in my life.
It's so interesting how many authors, I think James Rebanks, this is true of him, Wendell Berry, whose daughter we talked to, and actually Mary Berry herself, have these stories of leaving and then returning. And that's my story as well, actually. I grew up in Idaho and lived on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., and eventually found my way back to Idaho. And so I think it's really interesting to see that pull of place, and that love that animates each of these journeys in a really extraordinary way. So one quote from your book that applies to this, and I think captures it really beautifully, is as you write about the responsibilities of land ownership, you write, it means a community of people living and working together as one of Burke's little platoons. It means a balanced portfolio of businesses with an emphasis on property, tourism, and silviculture, as well as agriculture, and therefore a balanced landscape. And it means land managed for the long term, passed down from previous generations and held in trust for generations unborn. That is a big calling. That is a lot of work to take on, and a lot of various kinds of work to balance at once. In your experience, what does it mean to balance all these things well and to be thinking of them in kind of a prudential way?
Well, it kind of, I suppose, inevitably means you become a bit of a jack of all trades and a master of none. And then I added writing to that as well, because for a long time I was slaving away here and not making any money, and desperate to for any other income stream. So when the opportunity to write books and articles, things came along, I grabbed it, which arguably distracted me from some of the more pressing things I should have been doing. I think you don't start with a blank canvas, but you start with a canvas, and each generation then sort of takes it in a different direction. And part of that is down to new technologies and new trends in agriculture, and the political situation. I mean, Brexit was huge wake up call to us, and we took our farming in a completely different direction then. And it's partly down to what your interests are. I mean, the fascinating thing about the British landscape is you can really almost decipher what individual landowners' interests have been going back over hundreds of years, whether it's gardening or growing specimen trees or planting woods to drive pheasants out of, or planting little covers for foxes to lie in so that you can hunt them, or whatever it is. I mean, so I've as I've got older and increasingly conscious that my turn will come to an end at some point, probably in the next 10 years. I've tried to sort of do what I can for the nature, the wildlife on the estate, planted lots of hedges, and now a very exciting stage of laying lots of the hedges that we planted. And I've recently planted some orchards as well that I probably won't benefit me, but may hopefully give my son an income stream, and the ability to make cider and that sort of thing. And yeah, so it's whatever balance you want to make it really, but it does inevitably have to be a balance, and you just do what you can, but inevitably the opportunity to be proactive doesn't come around very often. You find yourself reactive a lot of the time, and really just dealing with the wolf that's closest to the sledge, um, and whether that's a deadline for an op-ed for the Daily Telegraph, or a holiday cottage tenant who's got no hot water and demanding my attention. So it's life is never dull, that's for sure, and it's intensely varied, and we're very lucky that if we're just really fed up, we can just go for a walk through beautiful countryside and listen to the bird song and chill out, which is not something that you can do necessarily in the center of a city.
It's very true. I need to garden some days in order to just rest mentally and emotionally from the struggles of the moment. It's interesting that pull toward long-term thinking, though, is I think perhaps something that distinguishes a lot of rural families and rural communities from their counterparts in other areas of the world. There is a sense of legacy that can be quite strong. And as you were talking in the beginning about the sense of distance or even of animosity that can exist between rural areas and urban areas, or the political kind of agencies that are situated in urban areas. How much do you think that is driven by the fact that a lot of these families and communities are trying to think long term about what will build true health, but there's often a pull towards short-term thinking and short-term gains on the part of the people who are often influencing them and the landscapes they live in?
Yeah. Well, we've suddenly been pitched into this extraordinary situation. Not here actually, down ironically in Wiltshire, just the other side of Malmesbury from Sunday Hill Farm, where Roger Scruton lived. Where my wife comes from, and her family did farm in Africa, actually in Zimbabwe, but they lost all that for obvious reasons. And when Mugabe took the farms away, and her parents started a new life here sometime before that actually, but they got out of what was then Rhodesia with not very much money, um, and they have this farmhouse with a tiny bit of land around it. It was a farm, but they just have the house, and suddenly and they're not by any means alone, but all of those people around there suddenly woke up one morning to find that their homes were going to be surrounded by a 3.5 square mile solar park. And quite apart from the familial ties that we have, and obviously we've been doing what we can to help them with their campaign to stop that happening. It's been an extraordinary example of how anywheres have suddenly assaulted the somewheres way of life. I mean, their lives will be completely different from now on if it goes ahead, because their landscape will be utterly altered. The walks that they go on currently through green fields will just be serried ranks of over 1 million solar panels. And again, that is, well, it's short term in as much as it's driven by this anxiety about net zero. The politicians have set what seems to be a pretty arbitrary timeline to have so many solar panels up and producing electricity by 2035, I think, in 11 years' time. And it's driven by the profit motive, we call it that, greed, really, in many cases, of an offshore company based in Bermuda, as far as I can see, or I think they have an office in London. It's an Irish company. They're not even British people, really, doing this. And so there's this extraordinary clash of cultures. There are 9 landowners involved, and I completely can empathize with them. I mean, they for some of them, perhaps it was a lifeline, all this money that they've been offered to have solar panels on their land, but also terribly sad, really, that all of that land that has been husbanded for generations, in some cases by their families, that's probably the end of it now. They're going to be covered in solar panels for the next 40 years, and then I guess thereafter they'll be treated as a brownfield site, and that will be the end of that countryside. It'll probably be built on or something. So I've been thinking a lot about how Roger Scruton would have responded in these circumstances. I mean, it's a stretch of country that he would have known well from hunting over it, walking over it, so it's this Lime Down solar park, it's called. That part of England is not downland, and there are actually very few lime trees. It's a completely spurious name, Lime Down Solar Park, designed to be completely anonymous, so nobody can look at a map and see where it is, as far as I can see. And so what we're seeing down there in that part of Wiltshire is an example of Burke's little platoon mobilizing. And my wife and I are on these WhatsApp groups now, and everybody's coming up with ideas and making banners and planning to go up to London on a rally. And it's a sort of really visceral sort of defense of countryside, of home, of oikophilia, against these globalist forces of turning the countryside into a electricity generating plant to get to net zero. And actually maybe scientists will look back and say, what were they thinking? The science is not all that settled on a lot of these things, and solar energy on farmland and is I gather not as efficient in the UK because of the hours of sunlight that we have as it might be. We perhaps be better doing it another way. And then the other thing is our food security in the UK is now pretty shaky. Probably not something that you can relate to very easily in the States, but here, we're a small island with lots of people and less land to grow it on every year. And we nearly got caught out quite badly during COVID, when suddenly the ability to import food dried up. And the war in Ukraine has also affected us. So food security is suddenly a big issue again, and all that farmland potentially disappearing under solar panels and being no good for growing food anymore. So yes, I mean that's quite a preoccupation at the moment, and one reason I've just been dipping into Roger's book, which he sent me, News from Somewhere.
Mm. It's extraordinary to think about this battle between kind of top-down initiatives and particularity, and a knowledge of what actually exists on the ground in a place, and how it pops up in various communities around the globe. That dissonance between solar panels in a place that they probably don't belong, or certainly don't belong, reminds me of, so here in the States, we often will grow cotton in Arizona. And if you know anything about cotton, it is one of the most water needy crops that you can grow. And why we would grow it in desert land is a question that is never fully answered, but the government has a lot of subsidies for growing cotton in the Southwest, and so we do, even though in terms of the actual neighborhoods and its impact on them is quite terrible. One thing you talk about in Land of Milk and Honey, I think, is the efforts to plant trees throughout various rural landscapes as part of carbon-focused planting initiatives. I know, if I'm remembering correctly, Welsh farmers have actually protested some of these efforts in their own neighborhoods. But oftentimes the efforts to plant trees as a carbon sink has no connection to the actual native plants or kind of historic landscapes that exist in these places. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean that is a big issue at the moment, and you're right. Across the UK, there are farmers getting on their tractors and driving towards London or Cardiff or wherever to protest. And again, I think it's a sense of helplessness that these sort of globalist forces of policies dreamt up in Davos and places that are suddenly having a massive impact on rural communities in this country. And there is this rather naive belief that when I call it four legs bad, one trunk good, trees are the panacea to stop climate change, cattle are the enemy. And it's nonsense, I think, having looked quite deeply into the science. I mean, the first thing is that that it's not binary. It's not a case of having trees or grass. You can have both. I've actually been experimenting here with turning parts of our farm into a sort of savanna landscape with these orchards with trees in that we will graze underneath. And that I think is going to be better at creating a carbon sink with much healthier soil, able to draw down the carbon out of the atmosphere through carbon dioxide being, going through the plants down into the plant roots and dying and creating humus and carbon in the soil. And I think that's really the way ahead. But politicians and civil servants have, they just put big hands on small maps and say, we need acres and acres of forestry. We don't need any farming, and that's having a devastating effect on rural communities. You've got landowners. I mean, typically in the UK, we have this. Not here on my farm actually, but a lot of estates, there would be the landowner who owns the land, and then there would be various tenanted farms. And tenancies are not being renewed. If the tenant runs out of money, can't carry on farming, gives his tenancy back. In the old days, you would have found another tenant. These days, the landowner, if he's in the uplands, he's just saying, right, well, plant trees. I can't make any money out of the land anymore. So we've got this sort of perfect storm of Brexit removing the subsidies and this race to get to net zero, encouraging farmers and landowners to give up farming and plant trees instead. There are government inducements to plant trees. And again, I think we'll wake up in 30 years' time. First of all, the trees will be worthless because all of the trees that were planted now will mature, will get to the point when they'd be the optimum time for felling them in 30 or 40 years. So there'll be a glut of timber on the market. And we'll lose all our biodiversity because as you alluded to, the Sitka spruce, which is the tree of choice around here, is a Pacific tree, a North Pacific tree that has really very little affinity, hardly any at all. No sort of synergies or symbiotic relationship with our ecosystem here. So hillsides are being plastered with Sitka spruce, and we're losing all our biodiversity. And it just comes back to this the need to think holistically instead of just following reductionist arguments, often through sort of groupthink and peer pressure, international peer pressure, and pressure from green lobby groups who don't really understand, a lot of them, the science either, to plant trees everywhere. And the effect on the community is, if you have a balanced landscape with trees, but with also with animals that need looking after, and hedges and walls that need mending, and ditches that need grubbing out every now and again, you have lots of employment. If you plant trees, you just plant the trees, and then there's absolutely nothing for anybody to do for 15 years at least, probably, until that maybe they need thinning or a little bit of attention. And you know, every sort of decade or so there'll be a bit of activity, and a gang will come in from somewhere else to do some felling or replanting or whatever. But it just destroys the local economy.
It's another monoculture or monocrop, right? Instead of actually trying to build diversity and a holistic landscape, we're just going down the same route of rejecting diversification and rejecting kind of the sort of small particular ecosystem that exists, and trending more towards the industrial way of doing things, which has always been to specialize and to monocrop, and then has these destructive impacts, 10, 20, 30 years down the road. It's really striking to think about the potential harms, but you, I think, have already highlighted, and I'd love to draw out some of the positive things that people can do and are doing, oftentimes not at great profit to themselves, but because they believe it is the right way to go about caring for their places. If you were to put together your own kind of agenda for what it would look like to steward local ecosystems in your community, what would be some of the most important things to highlight and to do?
Well, I'm always encouraging farmers in some ways that they need to do less, because our landscape is in danger of being too tidy, too ordered. We have these fantastic, or potentially fantastic, hedges in the UK that you probably don't have to the same extent in the States. And there is this sort of human urge to butcher them every year into sort of weird bonsai shapes, so they're actually no good for man or beast or bird, particularly birds. You need to, treat them more as flowering shrubs that bear fruit, and not as things that need to be shaped the whole time. And the same goes for verges that should just be frothing with weeds and wildflowers and brambles and nettles and things. There is a weird urge to mow everything and keep everything looking tidy, and it's not really in my nature to be very tidy. So I think our landscape has definitely become probably a little bit scruffier in some ways, and that hopefully will continue, because that's nature. That's what nature likes, and you get many more insects and birds and mammals in that landscape. And I think the soil is absolutely key to everything. I know you've had Gabe Brown on here, but it's been so noticeable that since we had no cattle here at all when I inherited, and we now have at any one time at least what have we got, 1,100-1,200 cattle here at any one time, and the impact has been extraordinary on insect life and bird life. And I would encourage everybody to go for a more mixed farming economy, because that is how it's supposed to be. If you go to any, you go to the Yellowstone National Park or the Serengeti or somewhere, you know, it's a landscape with herbivores in. And yeah, and I just I like the idea of this sort of savanna landscape if it could be made to work. There is this idea that if you increase your tree cover, counterintuitively, as long as you don't sort of shade out the grass, you actually get more grass, more productivity. But it's finding that balance. It's simply because the trees are recycling the nutrients the whole time and helping to retain moisture and that sort of thing. So I think we're at a really fascinating time at the moment, and because it's a sort of it's a bit like the start of the agricultural revolution. You know, we've learned so much in the last few years. People like Alan Savory and Gabe Brown, people like that, who have experimented with all these things, and we're having to unlearn hundreds of years of agricultural practices and go back to first principles. And I think we really can have it all. We can have a lot more carbon in the soil, which therefore not going to be in the atmosphere. We can have a lot more biodiversity, and we can grow lots of good healthy food in a great landscape. And I mean, so that's what we've found here in the last few years, when we've gone from churning out commodity wheat, not just sort of bog standard wheat, what we call feed wheat rather than milling wheat, and spraying everything and not having many trees or hedges or anything, to being way more profitable, producing 4 million litres of milk a year, probably what we'll produce this year, but in a landscape that's absolutely full of particularly of birds, but all forms of wildlife, because we're following the regenerative farming principles, and also, in a sense, wilding, although it's a controversial word, wilding parts of the estate that are not the most productive. Some of the wetter areas, we're digging ponds and allowing willow and things just to sort of take over, which is very exciting, because it's just, you know, you just wait to see what happens, and nature often sort of fills in the gaps much more imaginatively than you could have done.
It's really interesting. Something I feel like I'm noticing in a lot of interviews with farmers and books by farmers is this growing awareness that husbandry is not just care for the domestic side of the farm's life. It is also, and it has to be, kind of a care for and attentiveness to the wildlife that exists on the farm, not just because we want birds and wildlife to do well, but because they actually play this vital role in the ecosystem. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And well, we're at this strange point in time when conservation is sort of changing. I mean, we've always done conservation, but it's been largely linked to field sports, I suppose, for favouring some species over others, so that you can hunt them. And Roger Scruton wrote a great book called On Hunting, about sort of the whole kind of anthropology of man as a hunter-gatherer, and our deep cultural need to carry on doing that. And that has definitely been one of the drivers on this estate, and continues to be. We continue to shoot here. We have a pack of hounds here, but we're only allowed to take 2 of them out at any one time, which is something that the politicians have dreamt up. It has no basis in ecology or logic, but anyway, that's what happens. And I think so. I think on estates like this, that awareness of wildlife has always been very much there. It's perhaps been slightly more slanted, as I've said, towards certain species, but there was always a definite feeling that if you controlled the predators, it used to be called vermin back in the day, but I mean basically the predators, then everything flourished. That man is in the landscape to be a predator, and that if we shirk that duty, which we have now with certain species in this country, like badgers in particular, then that's going to cause problems to other smaller vulnerable species, and that's definitely starting to be the case in some areas. And here it's very noticeable. Certain, we've lost all our. I've got a hedgehog on my mug here, but it's the only hedgehog that you would see within 100 miles of here. When I was a child, there were hedgehogs everywhere, and as the badger population went up, the hedgehog population went down to the point where they are locally extinct. And so it's frustrating. And I think I wrote about this quite a lot in Red Rag to a Bull, that people in offices in cities who have absolutely no knowledge of what we do here, local conditions, just decree that we can no longer act as stewards of the food chain, if you like, on our farms in the way that we used to. And the science is nutty, because everybody, well, every environmentalist, as they like to call themselves, knows about trophic cascades, and they all say, oh well, we must bring the wolves back, because when they did that in the Yellowstone National Park, everything flourished, and it's all because the wolves were controlling everything else. And you say, well, yes, absolutely, that's our argument, that if we have to be the wolf. We can't have wolves here because we've got 300 calves out in our fields, and the wolves would go through them like a dose of salts, and the taxpayer probably would then have to write out a large check every time that happened, and that would get boring for everybody. And nobody really wants to go to explain to their children why their pony has been killed by wolves, as happened to Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU, last year. So we can't, realistically, apart from in possibly parts of the Highlands of Scotland, we can't have wolves in our landscapes, too highly populated and so on. But therefore, man has to be the wolf, and it's the same with the seals and the salmon, or there are so many different examples of where trophic cascades are not working, and it's largely our fault. We've knocked out the apex predators, but then done nothing about replacing that function.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've watched Clarkson's Farm at all, but he had at least one episode kind of looking at the impact of badgers on his cattle, and the impact of disease, really, and how do you contain the possibility of just mass disease, and therefore then having to slaughter cattle when you can't control or have really any impact on the badger population.
Yeah, and I think in the States you take zoonotic diseases, which TB is, very seriously, and where you've had TB outbreaks, you've been absolutely ruthless in taking out any animal that's likely to be a vector of any species, be it, I think you have, is it white-tailed deer or something? I think they had to cull a lot of in the States. And then it's sorted the problem, and it all goes back to normal again. Whereas in the UK, we've had this festering sore of TB. Luckily, touch wood, not in this area, but in England, and particularly the southwest of England. which for entirely political reasons has just been allowed to get out of control. And there have been a number of farmers who have committed suicide because of the loss and the stress it's caused. The badgers have suffered terribly because they get TB as well. And then, of course, many more of them have had to be culled because it got so out of control that they had to cull more of them. And I hope that one day future generations will look back and it'll be a case study in how not to interfere in the countryside, and and just an example of really bad government. I'm sure that one day sense will prevail, and we will go back to trusting farmers to manage the not just the land but also the wildlife on it in a way that we can't in this country at the moment. I think you probably can in the States, but we can't here.
It probably just depends a little bit on the state.
Yeah.
But yes, yeah, it's a definite issue, and hopefully the hedgehogs will come back.
Yeah.
It's very sad. In Red Rag to a Bull, you mentioned two articles that I thought your excerpts from them were fascinating, examining Brexit and the future of agriculture in the UK. And one of the authors suggested that the UK won't ever have a major agricultural industry again, because it is an island, and because some of its various environmental and geographic dimensions. Another just described the UK as post-agrarian. So what do you think of that language as someone currently living in that landscape and doing the work of a farmer? Is there room for local food production in the UK? And then maybe a secondary question is just, do you think that conversation has changed at all post-COVID? Because that did, I think, influence people's thinking a bit, it seems, on these questions.
I think I think it has. Well, it's certainly dealing with the second point, but I think the conversation has changed a little bit, and the narrative, there was a definite narrative before COVID of there was a guy called Professor Tim Lunig who was in Whitehall in some government department who said, the UK should be like Singapore and not bother about having any agriculture at all. We should just import everything. And I don't think anybody believes that now. We nearly ran out of food. There were empty supermarket shelves during COVID, and we were, ironically, I mean, Brexit had just happened not long before, and we'd really pissed off our European neighbours by leaving the EU. And I think the only reason they didn't just cut us off was that we are the land bridge to Ireland. Lots of lorries come through the UK. Come on a ferry, drive across the UK, go on another ferry, and go to Northern Ireland or wherever, and so they didn't close their borders, which they might have done. And if they had done that, I'm not saying we would have starved, but we'd have been very hungry because we wouldn't have been able to buy all the veg and stuff that we're used to buying down in from Spain and Holland and places. And I mean, I think Brexit is interesting. I mean, I was what they call a reluctant Remainer. I voted to remain in the UK because I felt that they were our biggest trading partners and all the rest of it. Since Brexit has happened, I've moved more towards being a Brexiteer. I mean, I think it's partly a function of moving from being a beef farmer to a dairy farmer. Dairy farmers have probably done better out of it, and we identify far more with New Zealand, where they took away all their subsidies, and their agriculture having perhaps not being as sufficient as it might have been, it suddenly became the most efficient in the world because they had to really get a grip of themselves and make it all work, which they did. And it's really what we've done here actually on this estate. We've gone to a completely New Zealand farming system. And I think for those people who are willing to embrace change and do that, then there is a bright future. Of course, those in less favored areas where the land just simply isn't good enough to grow crops or be good enough to graze dairy cattle, like James Rebanks' farm, which is we're at sea level here. He's 1,000 feet up or something. Then then it becomes very, very difficult, and you're then into sort of Scrutonian arguments about, well, if you allow free markets to, and I mean, I think Roger was actually quite pro free markets and anti the EU, but you have to do something to look after the communities and give them some reason to continue to be there to look after the land. And if they're not going to farm, what are they going to do? And you lose your tourism because the landscape falls apart. And that's sort of where the political debate's going a bit, and how you and they're all sort of fudging it really. They were a lot of politicians very, very keen to get rid of subsidies altogether, and now they're sort of rowing back from that and dressing up subsidies as environmental payments, which is basically what the EU did actually. So we're sort of we're not quite coming full circle, but getting that way.
I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on the question of aging landscapes. We mentioned that at the beginning, but that seems it's also a key part of the landscape's future and how rural farms are going to look, 100 years from now. What do you think currently is drawing young people to rural landscapes and to farm work, and what might be holding them back or convincing them to look elsewhere for their livelihoods?
Well, I mean, my farming partners and I were talking about this the other day, and it was that there's a frustration really that we're having to go and look all over the world really for people to come and work for us, because young people locally aren't interested. They don't want to get up early in the morning and milk cows, or go out in the rain and deal with problems about around the farm. So it's an extraordinary thing, because I mean we're probably some of the we probably pay our people well above what people are earning in shops or even offices in Dumfries. In the dairy industry, a young guy he can work his way up, be a manager of a unit like mine. He could be earning £100,000 a year before he's 30. And you can't and combine that with his quality of life and where he lives and all the rest of it. You can't really do that in almost any other walk of life, apart from sitting in a steel box in a city staring at a screen as a banker or something. So I just think it's extraordinary that more young people aren't coming into agriculture. Hopefully, if some of them are listening to this, they will reconsider their career choices. But I think part of the problem, and I don't know if it's the same in the States, but is our system of land holdings in this country, that many of them are really too small, if one's brutally honest about it, for the modern world. And the typical British farm was laid out in the previous century or the one before that, and it's probably it might be 150, 200 acres or something like that. And you simply don't have the economies of scale to make a decent living. And the stereotype of a farmer in this country is of an old guy, and well, I say an old guy of 60. I'm about to be 60, but somebody my age or older, sort of struggling to make a living with 100, 200 cows or something maximum, and his children have probably seen him struggling to make a living and not making much of a living, and they're probably in a city somewhere and not wanting to come home, or if they want to come home, they want to come home and live a comfortable life with their pensions. They don't want to farm. And I think we've really stored up a lot of problems for ourselves by politicians perpetuating those type of tendencies, and they've done it for the very noblest of reasons, to try to protect tenant farmers, give them security of tenure, but they keep changing the rules so that a tenancy could only be inherited by a son, and then it was a son or a daughter, and then it became a son's second cousin's auntie or wherever, and it just it's just perpetuated very small holdings, which, if one's brutally honest, are not going to survive without subsidy, unless they're very clever and they diversify into something really niche, which some people have done. But it's not always easy if haven't got particularly good soil, or your microclimate is terrible, or you're too remote to have a farm shop, or whatever it is. I mean, it's and so I think we are heading for a terrible crunch if we're not careful. We have to either carry on subsidizing small farms, which are, why should the taxpayer be asked to prop up inefficient businesses? I mean, it's a difficult argument to make. Or you have to kind of give people ladders to climb down to in the nicest possible way. Some of them perhaps move on and allow farms to amalgamate, to become bigger, and an investment to go in to create a more viable business. And in New Zealand, they didn't have this terrible crunch which might happen to us, because they had a far more flexible system. People didn't have long tenancies which lasted for generations, and they probably had bigger farms anyway, bigger holdings. There wasn't this sort of legacy of small farms going back hundreds of years, because New Zealand's got a young country, and they were able to manage it by older farmers or people who were disinclined to really go for it in order to compete internationally without subsidies. Just did what actually I've now done, really, is brought in partners to farm with them, so that to create the economies of scale. And that's really why they've been successful. And also they were able to devalue their currency to make their produce competitive, which is something we wouldn't be able to do in this country, because the knock-on effect of devaluing the pound would cause lots of problems in other parts of the economy. I mean, New Zealand has 37% of their economy is agriculture. Ours is 1% or something. So I think, there is this perception that agriculture is really unattractive, but it really isn't for young people who are ambitious, who want to get on it. It can offer a really good life. But I can understand, though, on the other side of the hill, as it were, or up the hill, young people not wanting to take over doing what their dad does, because it's just really hard work for very little reward.
Well, in the States, it seems we've got two sides of the coin, where on a lot of farms that aren't farmed well, you do have a lot of land. A farmer might have thousands of acres, but he's generally farming alone. If he has animals on his farm, just the humaneness of the farm may not be what it should be. And with that can come other problems that drive children away from the farm. The farm isn't a beautiful place to live, and a very lonely place oftentimes to live.
Yeah.
But then on the other side, of course, as you point out, sometimes you are doing everything right, and your landscape is quite healthy. But if it's small and you're doing it alone, the burden of work is just massive, and the
Yeah.
pay is not helpful either.
I know. And you know, you just can't afford the people to work on farms so much these days. I mean, you can with a dairy because you've got a milk check coming in each month, but some of these beef and sheep farms that would typically have had several people working for them, they've all disappeared because their wages have gone up year on year because the national minimum wage, things like that, keeps going up quite rightly to give people, make sure people are better paid and everything. But the price of food has just flatlined. In fact, in real terms, it's mostly been going down. And so, I mean, the most striking statistic that I heard a couple of weeks ago was I have a young guy who lives in one of our cottages here. He used to work for me actually now has a job in Dumfries, but he's 35. So 25 years ago, he was at our village school, primary school here, and there were 70 children in that school. 25 years later, there are 10, and it's probably going to close in the next month or so. They're talking about closing it. And that's, you know, working age people, people, you know, people who have children at primary school are, you know, typically in their 30s, I guess, aren't they? And they're just not here anymore because the jobs have dried up. You know, as there are less jobs in farming and forestry and all the primary industries, then you know, then there are also less jobs in all the other things that go along to support that. The village shops have been closing, and yeah. So as I said, I mean, there are a few lucky people. Well, I think they're lucky people who work in agriculture around here, but most of the others work for the government in offices in Dumfries, and so the rural community is really being stripped out. And I think it's a big problem, and I think politicians are not really addressing it, or they're addressing it in the wrong way. And we you know, they keep bumping the taxes up in Scotland, which destroys entrepreneurship because if you're ambitious, you want to make a lot of money, why would you do it in Scotland when you could hop over the border? I think the same thing happened in the States, didn't it? The sort of there was this kind of Laffer curve effect when if you had one state that had high taxes and the one next door had lower taxes, everybody just went and worked in the state next door. Well, you know, England is, well, I can see it out of my window. It's just England is just there. So there is not much incentive to settle in a place like this and start a business unless it's actually in agriculture because you know, land-based industry. But and so we're you know, we're losing those sort of people, and it's a problem. And we're gaining lots of old people who are perhaps retiring back to Scotland with their pensions, but they then, which probably happen to me in a few years' time, become a burden on the health service, and you know, they're economically sort of inactive. But I mean, I suppose they're creating jobs for carers, but you know, it's an aging population is a pretty scary thing, you know, because it's all, where did that happen in that last 25 years? How did our village school go from 70 children down to 10? And if that's the trend, what's going to happen in the next 25 years unless something big happens to reverse that? But at the moment, you know, all the incentives are sort of the other way, really, to go and be somewhere else. So I think it's very sad. But then an aging population, we're very, we really love living here. Our friend, the thing about as you get older, when you're, it's going to sound patronizing, when you're your age or you're younger, most of your friends are pretty much your own age, and then as you get older, they sort of go like that. So our friends tend to be between 40 and 90 now. It does mean we go to a lot of funerals, which is a bit depressing. But it's also very enriching, just having friends who are actually probably the generation above, really, but we don't really see it that way anymore. But it's not. It's a nice place to be, but for that point of view, but it's not a healthy thing for the economy at all, is it?
Well, it goes back to that idea of a holistic landscape. To some extent, the actual human population in a place must also be multi-generational and must
Yeah.
also bring a variety of talents to the table, or else we're still trending toward that homogenization of place that we don't need if we're going to be healthy.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other really dangerous thing that I suppose has happened is that when the landscape becomes, when the countryside becomes somewhere where only a very small minority have an active stake in it and are working in it, and the rest of them are just living here and enjoying the view, uh, and are often quite intolerant of things happening in that view, nasty smells or people, noise of combines working through the night to try and bring the harvest in, or mud on the roads because it's like now it's a really wet time and it's impossible almost to come out of a field without depositing a bit of mud on the road and with your tractor or whatever it is, or cattle crossing and holding the cars up. There's a danger of it becoming quite an intolerant sort of place where farmers and farming are very much the minority, which are just seen as a bit of a nuisance by everybody else. And I think I've seen that happening a bit as well in this community, because as I said, when the village school was full of farm workers' children, nobody really sort of thought that it was anything out of the ordinary that they had to wait for the cows to cross the road because they were going off to be milked, and now they get rather pissed off. So that is the danger of the sort of hollowing out of the landscape. And I've done what I can to try to bring young people in to do different things. We have a young beekeeper here who, I mean, it's her business, but she has about 40 hives here and other places as well. But she's I guess in her late 20s or 30s. We set up the hunt kennels here that created a couple of jobs, and the huntsman, because it's a very active sort of job, was always a young guy, and his son was about to start at the village school, and then a few months ago the politicians changed the law to make it almost impossible to go out hunting because you can only take 2 hounds, and so he's left, and there's one less child for the village school. I mean, that's just that's what happens when laws are passed that destroy businesses and young people leave, and all from a position of ignorance. And we've had a real problem, I think, in Scotland, because a devolution, which some of your overseas listeners might not understand, but the United Kingdom, Tony Blair felt that it was all too centralised. He wanted to decentralise it, so he created administrative centres. They weren't called governments initially, in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and the rationale was that it would bring government closer to the people, but actually it made it further away in many ways, because the UK government in Westminster had quite a lot of rural MPs from all over the country, whereas Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland are relatively large countries, but their populations are skewed in such a way that a lot of them are in cities in the central belt of Scotland or in the South Wales, and so you had suddenly had all these urban legislators who were, culturally much further removed from the people they were governing in the Scottish and Welsh countryside, and also really hung up on fighting a sort of class war against people like me. Really, to be honest, I mean, I don't think they're really motivated by a love of foxes when they ban fox hunting. They just hate the people who do it because they think that they are posh people or rich people or whatever. I mean, Roger Scruton wasn't posh or rich. Perhaps he was right at the end of his life from all his writing and everything. And he was probably typical of somebody who just loved fox hunting for its cultural significance, and he liked getting out in the countryside and observing nature and that kind of thing. So we have had these sort of culture wars to contend with that simply weren't there when I was a child. There was a sort of battle between left and right, socialism and capitalism, but there weren't the sort of culture wars that we see now, and that we are on the receiving end of very often in the countryside.
Yeah, I have more questions I would love to ask, but because of time and wanting to be sensitive to your time as well, I'll finish with this is a question we've asked all our guests, and I have to say it's been so fun. No two bookshelves have been alike, and so I expect this will be fascinating to see what volumes you might add to our list. But our question is, what books are you reading right now? What books are on your desk or interesting you currently?
Okay, well, I because I knew I was coming on here, and because also actually this horrendous issue with the Lime Down solar park in Wiltshire, close to where Roger Scruton lived. I've been rereading his news from somewhere on settling. Great book, and I've also been reading a bit Hunt for the Shadow Wolf, The Lost History of the Wolves of Britain by Derek Gow, who's not somebody I always agree with, but I agree with him on probably more things than I disagree with him on. But he's a rabid wilding enthusiast and wants to bring wolves back and that kind of thing. But it's fascinating reading about the history of wolves in the UK and how they were sort of hunted to extinction, and they've got all the sort of legends that grew up around them. And I'm just waiting for I mean I'm in the sort of happy but sad position of mainly reading books that I'm reviewing for various magazines. And it's probably the writers in the audience will probably empathize with, but I'm waiting, quite excited about a book called Living with Greys by Tarquin Millington Drake about conservation and about the landowners who are bringing back grey partridges, which are very much a red listed species here in the UK. And they're interesting because they only really thrive if you're farming really well for your ecosystem. And so I'm looking forward to reading that. So those are the three books that are sort of preoccupying me at the moment, although I haven't got my hands on the third one yet.
Excellent. The cover on that book about wolves is stunning. I love seeing some of that cover art. It's fun to see. Well, thank you, James.
I'm
Oh,
also
yeah.
writing a play at the moment, so I haven't got much time for reading.
Okay. Yes. Is
The
this
Enigma of Kidson.
excellent? When does that come out?
Well, we're hoping in the autumn.
Okay.
So I'm working on the script of that at the moment, which is quite a challenge because I've never had to be a dramatist before, but that's now something that's preoccupying me. So that's good fun.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. It'll be exciting to hear more as it gets closer to its release. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and all your insights. It's really been a delight to get to talk to you. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you.